Otherwise, everyone's like, why would you leave? Oh yeah, yeah, that's nice. That's sweet.
All right, thank you.
Oh, we're live. Yeah. It makes things easier.
Yeah, there we go.
Let's make things easier. Yeah. Like,
I guess.
since you have like,
How's the sound? Can you like go?
Where I live is too small to like have.
You're noting that shit.
But like, my grandparents are with us, but like my cousin's family, like it's like
I'm gonna put this here.
three aunts, all with their husbands and their children. They're like that's just one house with also grandparents.
What you said?
In the same neighborhood.
I just
Same house? Yeah. How big is it? 8, 7 rooms.
Maybe when
Yeah, I mean there's like a downstairs models.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We just put it over
Steve.
There you go.
Yeah, nice. Hi, Aaron. Nobody is here. We are here. You guys are people. Go ahead.
Is there anyone else?
We have a huge room. There's like the new
Just going around in case anybody's.
Yeah. To go to Virgin Space and have spicy pizza. The media is more visible. It's actually better than
Brought a few extra copies of my new book. If people are interested or something.
Yeah.
Literature table.
Oh, I think I see. Was that Nancy? Let's give it a few minutes. We expected a few more people to come.
This is the first panel.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Zayu.
Good to meet you. Hi.
I'm Zayu.
I'm good. How are you?
I remember meeting you at the East Coast Convention last year.
Oh yeah?
Yes, I know you, and yes, my first time meeting you. So,
Glad to be here.
yes.
Are you a student here?
No, I'm a member of Platypus. I joined when I was in college in Philly. So I'm just like 5 minutes in the city now.
Oh, you were one of those that Philadelphia crowd.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Yeah, they were very interesting group.
Yeah.
Of course. That's what we are.
Yeah, that's great.
Cool.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. What was your name? Your guru, the guy who was who runs the program.
Tony Montero.
Tony Montero.
Yeah.
Him?
Yeah, I'm friends with him.
He's a mentor.
We were at the WE Boys conference that they had. I was on that one and two.
Yeah.
It's a strange experience, but it was.
It was.
So fun. It was my first time seeing Cody before. It's very different.
Yeah.
From
So are you
the-
talking about the free school or
Platypus or
We were kind of around the preschool.
I was
because I was friends with them, but they couldn't stand the Platypus thing, so they kicked me out.
Oh,
That's another story.
I think Danny Jacobs would be the platypus.
Yeah.
Cool. This is exciting.
All right, wait until you get started.
Bother you? No.
Hi. Hi there. Yeah. Thanks.
All right.
Yeah, it'll be a couple minutes.
Oh my god. She looks really good.
Prices on them. Why didn't take like multiple? I didn't take like 3 actually. I took like 1. Oh, cute.
Yeah,
That's not even 8 times. By accident? Yeah, by accident. Why is it so funny?
what would you like to do?
I felt good about it, honestly. It was by accident. Because like self-checkout, I thought it scanned. I looked at the
Oh, what's up?
There's some kind of
Like ROTC.
Yeah. Downstairs they said like military ball or dictating something. We're asking when we said 9th floor. Oh, you want something. Yeah.
Do you have like a separate microphone plugged in?
No, we don't. We're just using the computer microphone.
Okay, try. Can you click on the plus sign?
Right, correction school in history, huh?
Yeah.
I'm just giving you audio options there. Your audio,
This is the only one I see.
yeah, that's perfect, right? Okay.
How about we turn this down?
Try turning on this just so you know.
You mean like mine?
Sorry. You can tilt that down by moving things down.
Oh, here. Oh.
Yeah.
How about
Tilt the
that?
camera down a bit. I can't quite see.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So turn down just the audio all the
Yeah,
way.
I know.
I don't even know what
So, working on it? The mic.
And then I think,
Can we connect to the mic?
yeah, turn down desktop audio all the way. Like,
Oh, here we go. How about if I turn this down?
turn them both down all the way. But not just quiet, just all the way.
How's
And
that?
then turn down desktop audio as well.
Yeah, I'm talking to Danny Parker right now.
So turn down desktop audio as well. All the way.
Yep.
Now scroll up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's see. Sorry.
How about now?
I'm just gonna mute while I check the audio. I think it's still happening. I just found out I have all these like audio. So can you click on the cog icon under audio mixer?
Oh, the what icon?
At the bottom of the audio mixer panel, there's a cog icon.
Yeah.
Yeah, click on that. Okay. Okay, click. Can you click active? Does that deactivate things?
No.
Or does it do anything?
I mean, we could deactivate them here.
Oh yeah, that'd be
Properties.
good.
Actually, there's no option to deactivate this here. Audio mixer. How about this?
Oh. Control comma to open settings.
I just turned off the video capture device audio. Let me know if that made a difference.
Yeah, I'll try that.
Or we can try this, maybe? How about that?
Can you turn off the audio a bit? It's like too quiet for me to hear.
Turn what? Turn off this audio?
Yeah, turn up a bit.
Oh,
So, yeah, try and get it into like the yellow zone. So down a little bit. Yeah, that's good.
How's that?
Alright, can I check it now?
Is it all right now?
Does that make sense?
So I think that's better. Could we get one of the analysts to say something instead?
All right. Aaron, could you just say something to the camera?
Hello, F world. How's that sound?
How's that sound, Danny?
Checking now.
How's?
I think if the live stream doesn't work, we should just start because these people have decided not to come, and we can make a recording and give it to them later because they have decided not to participate. So that's my personal.
Yeah, if this doesn't get resolved in the next minute, I'll just record this with my computer.
Okay. I don't think we should wait for him. It's already.
I think it's good.
And it's good now?
Is he coming? I mean.
Yeah. I think it's good now.
All right,
Okay.
perfect. Okay, we can get started.
We can use my phone.
Yes, please use that. We were going to use Dio's. Thanks for bearing with us, guys. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Okay, so let's get started. We're the Platypus Affiliated Society. So the Platypus Affiliated Society was established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political left 1980s to 1990s, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Here at NYU, we run reading groups and coffee breaks. The reading group is on Wednesday at 6 to 9, and the coffee break is on Monday from 6 to 9. So today, this is the American Constitution of the Left, this panel we're holding, and the prompt for the panel is the following. In 1865, Marx wrote the following to Abraham Lincoln on behalf of the International Working Men's Association. From the commencement of the Titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. Marx conceived of America long after the ratification of the Constitution as a revolutionary society, a thriving democracy fit to represent the interests of the workers of the world. For the left today, the meaning of the Constitution is unclear. Some on the left consider the Constitution anti-democratic or elitist and call for a new Constitution adequate to modern capitalism, citing Donald Trump's 2016 election via an electoral college majority as symptomatic of these faults, while others consider the Constitution to be a limit set by workers over the power of the state, one that has defended the rights of citizens and workers alike and continues to do so to this day. What relevance does the founding of the United States have today? How does the Constitution stand in the history of democracy? What is a democratic republic for the left? How should Marxists relate to bourgeois rights? And now I'll introduce our panelists in order in which they'll be speaking. So first we have Dan Lazar. Dan Lazar is a journalist. He's in the middle there. Dan Lazar is a journalist who writes regularly for the Weekly Worker in London. He's been published by the Communist Party of Great Britain. And he's also the author of The Frozen Republic, How the Constitution is Paralyzing Democracy, and 2 other books as well dealing with the Constitution. Then we'll have Caleb Maupin. Caleb Maupin is a widely acclaimed speaker, writer, journalist, and political analyst. He's the founder and ideological leader of the Center for Political Innovation. He was involved with the Occupy Wall Street movement from its early planning stages. In 2010, he was highlighted by Cleveland Scene magazine as the communist next door, after videotaping police brutality at a high school walkout. His footage resulted in the victims being acquitted in juvenile court. In 2015, he was at the center of an international incident as the only American on board an Iranian Red Crescent Society medical aid ship headed for Yemen. His latest book, which has been featured in China's Global Times and on the broadcasts of Kim Iverson, is called Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution. And finally, we have Aaron Haygood, the president of Platypus. Now each of the speakers will give their opening remarks, and we'll follow that up with the chance for the speakers to respond to each other, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Great. So how long do I have?
You have roughly, let's say, 6 to 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks very much to Platypus for having me here tonight. So let me just, I don't want to tout my own work, but in 1996 I published a book called The Frozen Republic, how the Constitution is paralyzing democracy. It actually did fairly well, but the book was really the first of its kind because it tried to grapple with the Constitution as a whole, not with this or that specific clause or amendment, etc., but with the logic of the entire document. Essentially what I argued, and I think what the book was published in '96, and I think what the events of the last quarter century have clearly borne out, is that the Constitution is a disaster in the making. And the reason is that the Constitution, first of all, is the sole source of political authority in the United States. Everything in our lives is determined by the Constitution, directly or indirectly. This paper is printed up by some kind of whoever makes this paper is a business which essentially whose laws must whose operations must accord with laws which must accord with the Constitution. So everything in our economy, our society, our culture, in some way derives its legitimacy from this ultimate source of legitimacy, which is the U.S. Constitution. The problem with the Constitution is twofold. Number one is that it's logically incoherent in that it opens with a preamble which advances a very sweeping definition of popular sovereignty, in which we the people can ordain new constitutions as we see fit in order to improve our society, and in the process also implicitly we the people can toss out old constitutions as well, out of the same drive, same desire. But then the rest of the document essentially is at war with popular sovereignty. It tries to constrain it, limit it, nip it in the bud. The best example is Article 5, which is the amending clause. And you may remember from your high school days, the amending clause says that in order to pass a new amendment, you must have the approval of 2/3 of each house plus 3/4 of the states. That means that 13 states can veto any structural change whatsoever. 13 states can be as little as 4.4% of the U.S. population. So essentially, there is a tiny, the Constitution enables tiny minorities to veto any desire for any fundamental structural change. So structural change is therefore impossible. And by the way, that 4.4% figure is steadily declining. So the U.S. has an 18th century constitution, which is more and more constrictive as time goes on, and therefore the society grows, structurally speaking, more and more conservative as time goes on. So the U.S., in a strange way, finds itself in the same boat as the Russian Empire or the Chinese Empire. These were vast structures that grew more and more rigid, constrictive, and conservative as the centuries wore on, until finally they completely collapsed. One in 1917, the other in 1911, I guess. And that is clearly the path the U.S. is on. Our politics have stopped working. I mean, what passes for politics in Washington is a complete joke. Checks and balances have totally broken down. We have warfare on Capitol Hill. We have government by character assassination. There's no policy making to speak of, because even when individual senators and congressmen try to make policy, it takes place in this completely anarchic atmosphere in which, double dealing, self-dealing, behind the scenes deals, etc., take over. And there's no possibility of any remotely coherent policy making emerging out of that process. the U.S. Since I wrote my book in '96, since then we saw the impeachment of Bill Clinton. We saw the stolen election in December 2000. We saw 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, which were carried out by tiny little cabals in the White House with no public oversight to speak of, little public debate. We saw another stolen election in the sense that the Electoral College was able to override the popular vote in 2016. We saw an attempted coup d'état in 2020 or early 2021, and since then we've seen nothing but endless warfare, and the chaos is growing. The constitutional vice is tightening. The options for any kind of change within a constitutional framework are nearing zero. We live in a minority dictatorship. We have a Senate, for example, which gives the same vote to Wyoming that it does to California, even though the population differential between the two is nearly 7-1. The figures are astonishing. Essentially, a majority of the population lives in just 10 states, which are outvoted 4-1 in the Senate. 83% of racial minorities live in those 10 states, and they are outvoted even more heavily. I think that the 60 votes needed for the 59 votes, the 60 votes needed to break a filibuster. I think a filibuster, the amount of filibusters, actually 41 states from as little as 17% of the population. The House is heavily gerrymandered, so the Republicans have enjoyed a consistent 2 to 10% advantage in terms of House representation. The Electoral College leans very heavily to white rural states, and the Supreme Court, which is chosen by a president chosen by the Electoral College and jointly with the Senate, is now dominated by a 6-3 ultra-conservative majority, which is apparently unbreakable for at least a decade. So therefore, we are in the grips of a right-wing minority dictatorship, and there is no solution to the problem within the constitutional framework. Within the existing political structure or constitutional structure, absolutely nothing can be done. And anybody who tells you otherwise is lying. So the structure is collapsing in the same way that the Tsarist structure was collapsing, and the same way that the Chinese imperial structure was collapsing. And that simply means that America is heading for a rupture, where either there are only one of two possibilities: either America slides into a long-term, sclerosis in which all the institutions harden, become less and less responsive, more corrupt, more controlled by an oligarchy. This is the pattern that happened in Venice, for example, in the 18th century, where the Venetian Republic just decayed and died and became infinitely corrupt and backward and oppressive. Or there is a rupture, and the rupture will happen when the Constitution is overthrown, and America essentially enters into a no man's land, where it has to essentially reconstitute itself, recreate a new structure ex nihilo, just as the founders did in 1787. And that act of reconstitution will not take place under the aegis of the Constitution, but will take place under its own authority, under the principle of popular sovereignty, the principle enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, which says that the people, have the right to create new government when they see fit, when their self-interest, their political interest, dictates that option. So anyway, that is, I think, is clearly where we are heading. So my prognosis is both grim and optimistic. There is no hope whatsoever in the present structure, but some kind of a possibility of a rupture / creative opening is approaching.
Okay. Well, I want to start out by thanking the Platypus Affiliated Society for extending this invitation to me. I remember the first time I ever encountered members of this organization. I was at the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit in 2010. It was just after the financial crisis, and I remember at the U.S. Social Forum there were different Marxist groups and socialist groups that had literature tables, and members of this organization were going around and asking tough questions to the people at the tables. And it's funny because at the time I found that to be quite annoying. I found that to be quite frustrating. They were asking questions that seemed to be forbidden. But now I look back on that and I realize that while I may not agree with the manner in which these questions were being asked, people needed to ask questions. What it means to be a leftist or a Marxist or a socialist in America is something that people really need to wrangle with. And actually, in the last 10 years, it's gotten much harder to ask questions than it was back in 2010. So I want to say that I appreciate the work that you're doing. I appreciate you asking questions, and I appreciate you having me here tonight. Context is the most important thing in any political discussion. If I were to get up in front of this group in the 1930s and talk about defending the Constitution, in that context, I would be aligning myself with the American Liberty League, with the National Association of Manufacturers, with the German American Bund, and other groups that considered Roosevelt to be a brutal dictator. I would be arguing that Roosevelt was a communist who was threatening our constitutional freedoms, and I would be aligning myself with the Axis powers and the fascists, and I would be positioning myself against the Communist Party. However, speed forward to the 1950s. In the early 1950s, if I were to get up in front of this group and say I was advocating defense of the Constitution, I would be standing up against McCarthyism. I'd be standing up for freedom of speech. I would be standing up to the far right wing that was trying to outlaw the Communist Party, that passed the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1951, that allowed for Communist Party members to be rounded up and put in a network of prison camps. It was a horrendous law that was passed. So I could be making the exact same arguments and making the exact same statements, but in that context, it would have a very different meaning than if I'd said it just a decade or so before. And that's why the context is so important. Let's not forget that it was communists who started the American Civil Liberties Union. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was one of the founders. Let's not forget that throughout the 1960s, the 1950s, it was generally the left who was pushing for an expansion of constitutional liberties and constitutional freedoms. And the talk about original intent, activist judges, all of that started with the rise of neoconservatism in the mid-70s and the 80s, up into the 90s. And let's also not forget that during the Bush years, one of the main arguments of the left was to defend constitutional freedoms. They saw Bush, who said, you're either with us or against us, or either with us or with the terrorists, the Patriot Act. They were the ones speaking up. And so the context of the remarks I'm making tonight are important. And I want to separate our current political situation from my overall ideological critique of the Constitution. I would argue that it is correct now to defend the Constitution, but that doesn't mean I think the Constitution is sacred. That doesn't mean I think the Constitution is eternal. That ultimately doesn't mean I even want to keep the Constitution. I'm a socialist, and I realize that the process of overturning capitalism in the United States will mean the creation of a new state apparatus. It will mean the creation of a new constitution, a new military, a new policing agency. So I'm not here to say that the U.S. Constitution is a sacred document that is eternal. I'm here to talk about the current context in which debate around the U.S. Constitution is taking place. Let's talk about what's going on in the country right now and why at this moment, defense of the Constitution is necessary. The Uhuru movement, a group of black Marxist socialists, have just been indicted by the federal government. They are facing 10 years in prison on grounds that they spread Russian propaganda, that they are sowing discord. Congress is currently discussing the Restrict Act, which is a horrendously repressive law that would be a huge violation of our civil liberties and would essentially enable the executive branch of the US government to declare any individual to be a foreign asset or a foreign agent or aiding a foreign power, seize their property, violate all of their civil liberties in terms of search and seizure, privacy, etc. It's a very dangerous law. Julian Assange is rotting away in a British prison, facing extradition to the United States to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. It's recently been revealed that the social media outlet known as Twitter was coordinating with US security agencies, the FBI and others, to silence certain political perspectives. And it was revealed a lot of what's been going on, that how social media is essentially being manipulated by the government to suppress certain viewpoints. Viewpoints, in some cases, that have turned out to be actually true when it came to the pandemic and the vaccine question, when it came to a number of issues. And the government was coordinating with the social media companies to shut them down. The journalist Matt Taibbi testified about this to the US Congress, and in response to that, he was sent a letter by a member of Congress threatening to jail him, arguing there was some inconsistency in his testimony and suggesting that they would bring criminal charges against Matt Taibbi for lying to Congress and putting him in jail for his testimony about this. This is the context of the debate about the Constitution. There is a movement in this country that is centered around defending Joe Biden, defending Kamala Harris, and defending the current administration. And their argument is the same argument that was used by the McCarthyists during the 1950s and the witch hunts. It's the same argument that was used by the Bush administration during the aftermath of 9/11 and the move towards the beginning of the War on Terror, which is their argument is there are certain bad people. And these people are just so bad that constitutional liberties and the Constitution itself needs to be put on hold so that they can be silenced. And the list of bad people includes a lot of bad people. Let's not joke about that. The list includes racists, sexists, but it seems to get longer and longer every day. Those who are spreading Russian propaganda, those who are asked questions about the trans issue, those who ask questions about vaccines, those who ask questions about any issue, immediately get added to this really long list of bad people. And it is therefore, because these people are so bad, and because their message is so dangerous, it is therefore the responsibility of the government to coordinate with social media to shut them down. And we now have the New York Times with their 1619 project that's gone as far as to argue that the entire purpose of the United States from the beginning was simply for slavery. The entire cause of the American Revolution is simply racism and slavery. So on that basis, we can just completely nullify everything. There's talk of the Supreme Court nullifying the Electoral College. There's talk of the Supreme Court basically throwing out all kinds of liberties. And the argument is that that's okay because there are certain bad people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. They need to be silenced. They need to be shut down. And so therefore, the moral imperative is to get rid of the Constitution. And if you object, you are de facto an ally of these people, and you need to be silenced, and you need to be shut down. These are very dangerous terms of discourse. And if this is taken further, it could have very, very dangerous implications. The Restrict Act should frighten anyone who's concerned about civil liberties, and especially anyone who considers themselves to be a Marxist or a leftist or an anti-imperialist of any stripe. Dissent in this country has historically been suppressed by the powers that be. What I'm excited about is that there seems to be a new coalition emerging. And this coalition is very politically diverse. I was honored as part of the Center for Political Innovation to be a sponsor of the Rage Against the War Machine protests that happened in Washington, D.C. back in February. And at those demonstrations, you had leftists like Jimmy Dore, you had the Libertarian Party and the Mises Caucus as sponsors, you had Tulsi Gabbard, the former congresswoman from Hawaii, you had former Fox News hosts and contributors, you had Dennis Kucinich, you had so many different voices coming together and saying the way the country is moving, which is toward a low-wage police state at home and World War III against Russia and China, this direction that the country is moving in must stop. that the forces that have seized power in Washington, D.C., their stated purpose is to spread freedom around the world by tearing down any government that breaks out of the Western financial system. And their stated purpose is also to reduce consumption, to reduce the population, and in the name of climate change, essentially lock down society, make everyone poorer. And that there is a broad coalition of forces that are seeking to resist that. I would argue in our time we're seeing a long-term crisis of overproduction. The computer revolution has made what Marx wrote about poverty created by abundance, poverty created by technological advancement, the tendency of the falling rate of profits. It has made that more real than ever before. And as Marx observed when writing about France in 1851, when you have a long-term capitalist crisis, a liberal capitalist society will collapse into some form of illiberalism. This is called Bonapartism. It's the result of a capitalist crisis. It's an attempt to liquidate the crisis in order to stabilize capitalism. And I would argue that there is a Bonapartist move on the part of some of the richest forces in the United States. And the richest forces in this country, we're talking about the Silicon Valley tech monopolies, we're talking about the Rockefeller family and some of the big oil monopolists and some of the entrenched dynasties in this country. They argue that in order to reset the capitalist economy, we need to dramatically reduce consumption. And we need to have an all-out campaign against Russia and China and Venezuela and Iran and any country that is standing up to them around the world. And they are ready to move ahead with it. Whereas the lower levels of capital, they have a different perspective. And for their own selfish reasons, they don't want to go along with it. It would be at their economic expense. And so they are resisting it. And this creates the opportunity for a kind of new popular front, a new coalition to be formed against degrowth, against the low-wage police state, against the attacks on our civil liberties, and against the danger of World War III. And part of that would be a defense of the Constitution at this time. But let me add that I would say we're essentially arguing that you should defend the Constitution so we can change it. I would like to see a constitutional amendment that would guarantee the right to jobs, healthcare, education, the economic Bill of Rights that Roosevelt spoke about. I'd like to see that added to the Constitution. I'd like to see added to the Constitution public ownership of banking, so that banking could be done in the overall interest of the public, not in the interest of big finance and corporations. I would like to see added to the U.S. Constitution public ownership of our natural resources and making sure that our economy was organized to serve the people, making sure that the natural wealth of this country was used in the interest of the population overall. And in addition to that, I mean, Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution does allow for a new constitutional convention. And in the process of progressive struggles and change, I would argue that we probably will get to the point that there will be a new constitution. At the point of, great struggles for justice taking place around the world, the people of this country will probably begin to assert the need for a new form of government, and that is part of the process. But right now, I would argue that it is necessary for those of us who oppose World War III and oppose the low-wage police state, it is necessary for us to defend the U.S. Constitution. You can see it the way Lenin called for defending the British Labour Party. We can be defending it the same way a noose supports a hanged man, but it must be defended because if the forces that have their grip on power in Washington, D.C. are able to get away with what they're doing, all hope is off the table. Thank you.
I want to start my presentation with just a few quotes that I thought were interesting. I hope they're not too much of a non sequitur. Oh, I'll speak loudly. I can. In the Principles of Communism, I don't want to join NYU guest. Sorry. In the Principles of Communism, Engels writes, "In America, where a democratic constitution has already been established, the communists must make the common cause with the party which will turn this constitution against the bourgeoisie and use it in the interest of the proletariat." Robert Frost in 1915 wrote a poem called The Black Cottage. "Whatever else the Civil War was for, it wasn't just to keep the states together, nor just to free the slaves, though it did both. She wouldn't have believed those ends enough to have given outright for them all she gave. Her giving somehow touched the principle that all men are created free and equal, and to hear her quaint phrases, so removed from the world's view today of all those things. That's a hard mystery of Jefferson's. What did he mean? Of course, the easy way is to decide it simply isn't true. It may not be. I heard a fellow say so. But never mind. The Welshman got it planted, where it will trouble us 1,000 years. Each age will have to reconsider it. And then finally, in Should America Go Communist, Leon Trotsky wrote, American Soviets will be as different from the Russian Soviets as the United States of President Roosevelt differs from the Russian Empire of Tsar Nicholas II. Yet, communism can come in America only through revolution, just as independence and democracy came in America. The American temperament is energetic and violent, and it will insist on breaking a good many dishes and upsetting a good many apple carts before communism is firmly established. Americans are enthusiasts and sportsmen before they are specialists and statesmen, and it would be contrary to the American tradition to make a major change without choosing sides and cracking heads. The other day, a student of mine who is at Barnard asked me what the origin of the First Amendment was. She said that a libertarian had told her that the Second Amendment was the foundation of the First Amendment because you need the right to bear arms in order to protect your freedom of speech. Another student in her class, she said, had argued that its origin, like the whole Constitution, was the protection of slavery and the elite. I felt this was a good snapshot of how the Constitution is discussed today, in the context of its crisis. The deep state attack on the presidency of Donald Trump, the related criticism of the Electoral College raised by the left against him, the suppression of speech around the Ukraine war and the 2020 election, and questions about the meaning of the Supreme Court are all indicative of a broader crisis of the Constitution, raised in and through the crisis of capitalism. I tried to answer my students' question as best I could. The First Amendment, like all of the Constitution, is an objectification of the revolution itself. The ongoing crisis of the bourgeois revolution is a crisis of the Constitution. The American Revolution was organized by the complex public sphere created by the emerging bourgeois society. American opposition to the Stamp Act, for instance, which put a special tax on printed material, and the organization of the revolution through committees of correspondence are all indicative of this. From freedom of speech to the right to bear arms to the prohibition of quartering soldiers, the Bill of Rights is suffused with the experience of the American Revolution itself. But it is not just the Bill of Rights. Although the left in the 20th century has often bemoaned the separation of powers in the Constitution as the Constitution of the slaveholders and aristocrats, and I'm thinking here of Earl Browder, who I feel Caleb has kind of referenced maybe in a subterranean way. We can get into that later. We can find the origin of the three branches of government and separation of powers in the experience of the American Revolution. The Virginia Constitution of 1776, adopted alongside the Declaration of Independence, declared dissolution of ties with Britain and denounced the detestable and insupportable tyranny of King George III. I assure you, King George III had done very little to stop slavery in America, but he had levied numerous taxes on the burgeoning bourgeois class and used his colonial administration to suppress the emerging revolution on the continent. The division of powers was envisioned as a mechanism for forestalling the potentially oppressive qualities of government itself. Checks and balances, far from being a tool against the people, was envisioned as a safeguard for the people, so that government could not violate the freedom of society. The first test of this nation, conceived in liberty, was the expansion of the revolution to Europe during the Great French Revolution of 1789. As in Britain, support for the revolution was suppressed in the United States. The Alien and Sedition Acts attempted to roll back freedom of speech. They represented a break with the course of the revolution, which was restored by Jefferson's Revolution of 1800. His restoration of the Constitution, not to mention his monetary support for Napoleon, bolstered the tide of bourgeois revolution internationally. Beginning with the Civil War, the next event of world historical importance to emerge from the new continent, the crisis of the Constitution would coincide with the crisis of capitalism. On the occasion of Lincoln's re-election, Marx wrote to the embattled president, quote, "When an oligarchy of 300,000 slaveholders dared to inscribe, for the first time in the annals of the world, slavery on the banner of armed revolt, when on the very spot where hardly a century ago the idea of one great democratic republic had first sprung up, whence the first declaration of the rights of man was issued, and the first impulse given to the European revolution of the 18th century, when on those very spots counter-revolution with systematic thoroughness gloried in rescinding the ideas entertained at the time of the formation of the old Constitution, and maintained slavery to be a beneficent institution, Indeed, the old solution of the great problem of the relation of capital and labor, and cynically proclaimed property and man the cornerstone of the new edifice. Then the working classes of Europe understood at once, even before the fanatic partisanship of the upper classes for the Confederate gentry had given its dismal warning, that the slaveholders' rebellion was to sound the tocsin for a general holy crusade of property against labor, and that for the men of labor, with their hopes for the future, even their past conquests were at stake in that tremendous conflict on the other side of the Atlantic. Everywhere they bore, therefore, patiently the hardships imposed upon them by the cotton crisis, opposed enthusiastically the pro-slavery intervention of their betters, and, for most parts of Europe, contributed their quota of blood to the good cause." End quote. Marx saw that the Confederacy, in its opposition to the Constitution in the Revolution of 1776, represented a conservative solution to the crisis of society, a repetition and intensification of the problems posed already by the 1848 revolutions in Europe and the coup of Louis Bonaparte. In 1891, Woodrow Wilson, that the functions of government are in a very real sense independent of legislation and even constitutions. He complained later in 1913 as president that the Constitution was founded on the law of gravitation. The government was to exist and move by virtue of the efficacy of checks and balances. The trouble with the theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live. The Constitution was, for the progressive Wilson, as later for FDR, an obstacle to progressive capitalism, and therefore an obstacle to his solution to the First World War and the international revolutionary crisis it occasioned. The language of insurrection inherited from the Civil War was seized upon by progressivism, not, as in the 1860s, to suppress the counter-revolution, but rather to suppress demands for socialism and criticisms of the First World War. Famously, it was used to imprison Eugene Debs for his criticism of the war and his support of the revolution. This suppression of speech made its way to the Supreme Court, which wrung its hands trying to reinterpret the First Amendment to allow the suppression of speech, which is a clear and present danger. It is from this period that we receive the kind of common phrase, "You could not yell fire in a crowded theater." The scope of this problem, freedom versus safety, pierces through history. It echoes with the language of much of the left today as regards free speech and the validity of COVID lockdowns. It also points back to Marx's own criticism of the 1848 French Constitution, which allowed for the rights guaranteed by that Constitution to be suspended in the name of public safety. Is this proof that the Supreme Court is arrayed against the proletariat? It is not so simple. In one case regarding a pamphlet written by supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution, Justice Holmes wrote that, quote, "If proletarian dictatorship is bound to win over the public, then it ought to be allowed to govern." And thus is contained the whole problem. What is democracy? The demand for the state and for the participation of the masses in the state is a violation of the self-understanding of the revolutionary tradition of the 18th century. The document issued from 1776 sought to protect from politics and from the state the revolutionary social body whose emergence it announced on the stage of world history. The demand for democracy and the repeating demand for universal suffrage is for Marx a symptom of the crisis of capitalism. This does not mean a symptom of the existence of classes or whatever else, but rather of the epochal problem of the transitional society. It is a category of contradiction, a phenomena of the coming of the bourgeois revolution into self-contradiction and crisis, and ultimately of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. When Marx called in 1864 for the proletariat to take up the political struggle, he sought to link the constitutional crisis of the American Civil War to the revolution that had begun in 1848, so that the unfulfilled bourgeois revolution may attain proletarian leadership. Socialism is not opposed to liberalism, but seeks to take up the desiderata of liberalism in its crisis. The proletarian revolution is not made against the bourgeois revolution, but rather to work through the unfinished tasks of that revolution in its hour of need. Marxism, as the highest critic of socialism, sought to clarify the world historical task of human freedom. In the absence of all this, socialism is liquidated into progressive capitalist democracy, for the continuation of the best of all possible worlds, over and against the bourgeois constitution of the American Revolution. The little man in whose name this is accomplished is left adrift. As Horkheimer once said, his interest lies in the Marxist clarification of the concept of freedom.
Starting with Dan, you get the chance to respond to each of the panelists.
Okay,
Keep
great.
it to like 5 minutes or so.
Okay, fine. Let me start with Aaron. One problem I have with what you said is there's a too simple, too facile equation of the American Revolution with the French Revolution. The two were very different. The American Revolution was really a part, obviously, came first by 13 years. And it was very much typical of the 1770s and the 1780s prior to 89, in which revolutions were generally conceived in conservative, backward-looking terms of restorationist terms, of returning to an era of freedom. The American Revolution was suffused with that kind of ideology and rhetoric, where the freedom lay in the past. Everything had been fine until 1763, when the British decided to use their colonies as revenue pumps and started imposing taxes, bypassing the colonial legislatures, which was a new innovation, which the colonists did not like, and they rose up in defense of their existing liberties. And bear in mind that America, prior to 1763, was, for its white inhabitants, the freest, most democratic, and most prosperous society in the world. Far more democratic than Britain, for example, far more democratic than France. And so the American Revolution was really fought in defense of existing liberties. The Civil War is a very different affair. It is much closer in spirit to the Jacobin Revolution. But the American Revolution in some ways got to be seen as almost antithetical to the French Revolution, the last expression of the ancien regime, not the opening blast of the new modern age that the French Revolution inaugurated. When you said before that socialism is not opposed to liberalism, I'm not really quite sure what that meant. But actually, there is a very sharp line between socialism and liberalism. Not between socialism and democracy, but democracy and liberalism are two very different things. Socialists do not conceive of democracy in terms of a checklist of individual rights. So let me say we have free speech, we've got a free vote, we've got rule of law, et cetera. Therefore, we have democracy. Democracy means, first and foremost, popular sovereignty, which was briefly enunciated in very abstract ways in the Declaration of Independence and the preamble, but really was belied by subsequent American development. I mean, bear in mind that the American Revolution constitutionally strengthened slavery. It rendered it legally impregnable in a way it had not been before, and paved the way for a vast expansion of slavery, to the Mississippi and beyond over the next 77 years. Ironically, the Revolution and Constitution wound up strengthening slavery and strengthening anti-slavery, which therefore paved the way, made inevitable the Great Clash of 1861 to 65. So I just think you've got to be, and I'm aware of what Marx wrote. And by the way, Marx during the Civil War, he used the word democratic to describe America, I think more in bourgeois economic terms, in which America was a place there was no aristocracy, there was legalistic equality, etc., and bourgeois uniformity, at least in the North. But Marx wrote in 1862, he expressed the hope that the constitutional stage of the Civil War was over, and that America was now entering a revolutionary stage. And so therefore, Marx looked forward to the overthrow of the Constitution and the opening up of a new period of revolutionary struggle. He turned out to be incorrect. His forecast was wrong. But nonetheless, he saw a great difference between those two political approaches and epochs. Now, on to Caleb. Caleb, I mean, what you say is such an amazing melange. I don't know where to begin. When you say defending, we have to defend the Constitution because the Supreme Court is going to nullify the Electoral College. I read the New York Times every day. I have not seen the Supreme Court making any noises about nullifying the Electoral College. There's no conceivable constitutional and legal basis for the Supreme Court to nullify the Electoral College. You said that you somehow want to defend against these various bad things that are happening to groups like the Uhuru movement. And by the way, I agree with you that the prosecution is absolutely outrageous. But how do you use the Constitution, a completely incoherent document, studded with anti-democratic features like the Electoral College, like the Senate, like a gerrymandered House, like states' rights, so on and so forth? How do you use that to somehow defend these members of the Uhuru movement? If they are prosecuted, they will be prosecuted according to the letter of the law, I'm quite sure, in a way which the judiciary will decide is consistent with the Constitution. So how can you use this anti-democratic document to defend against an anti-democratic action? The Rage Against the War Machine rally, I mean, this was one of the most foolish events in recent history, in which certain leftists paraded critics of the war in Ukraine before a speakers list dominated by fascists and semi-fascists, essentially putting the best face possible on these neo-Nazis and militias and Second Amendment fans. I mean, this was a complete travesty, and anybody who was involved in this rally, what a confession of political poverty. And you talk about the threat of Bonapartism. Well, we all know where the chief threat of Bonapartism comes from. It comes from Donald Trump. It doesn't come from the ACLU. It doesn't come from Tony Fauci. It comes from Donald Trump. Now, you can't defend against Donald Trump with the Constitution because Donald Trump, was the one who's repelled into the White House by the Electoral College, which apparently you want to defend against the ravages of the Supreme Court. I really have no idea what that even means. But we all know that Donald Trump is the candidate who is heading in a Bonapartist direction. And you have actually had to say if that's some rather forgiving things to say about Donald Trump, if I am correct. You want to bring back the Popular Front. The Popular Front was a travesty. The Popular Front was what saw liberals making excuses for the Moscow show trials, and the terror, the nightmare that was descending upon Moscow. We saw good liberals, trying to defend Stalin's crimes, and somehow saying, and attacking those few brave souls who dared to speak out against the Stalinist terror, in the name of anti-fascism. In other words, you couldn't oppose Hitler if you opposed Hitler, you had to defend Stalin in the Moscow show trials. I mean, it was a completely nightmarish period, and you want to bring it back. That's just great. And you talk about somehow you think that what we're seeing now is an intra-capitalist clash where you have one monopolistic layer of the bourgeoisie arrayed against lesser capitalists, and that's the intra-bourgeois conflict that you think is such a great opening. I mean, we have, we've seen a maddened petty bourgeoisie before in history. Yes, and it's a decidedly unfruitful path to go down.
Okay. Well, I think it's good that you brought up the 1930s and the Popular Front, because if you look at that period in Western politics, with the rise of Hitler, with the Soviet Union very strong, one trend that you'll notice is that all major ideological groups seemed to divide during that period. For example, here in New York City, if one was an advocate for the rights of African Americans, one wanted to have a religious or political movement for the rights of African Americans, one organization one could join was the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam was very critical of Roosevelt. The Nation of Islam didn't feel that Japan was someone that black people should fight against, and they positioned themselves against Roosevelt, against the Soviet Union. And then you saw the rise of Father Divine in Harlem. Father Divine was an African-American minister, very religious, dedicated to the liberation of black people, but he liked the Soviet Union. He hung out with Earl Browder, and he also he liked Roosevelt. And that the black liberation movement divided over the question of what side you were on. In Britain, you had Oswald Mosley. He was the leader of the British Union of Fascists, and he was an admirer of Hitler. He was very opposed to Britain, opposed to the Soviet Union, opposed to communists. He built this conservative movement of young men that were, living together and exercising together and being ultra-masculine. And so you saw then the rise of the Oxford Group. And U.S. Pastor Frank Buckman started the Oxford Group. And it was a group of very conservative, very religious young men who exercised together and were ultra-patriotic, but they supported the British. And in the United States, if you were a fan of Roosevelt, if you were a fan of the Soviet Union, you could join the Communist Party if you were interested in Marxism. And if you were a critic of Roosevelt and you also felt that World War II was not justified and that you wanted to form a union to disrupt the war effort, you could join the Trotskyites. The same ideology, Marxism, was split to serve different purposes, just like black liberation was split, just like conservative ultra-masculinity was split in Britain. That's what we're seeing in the United States right now. Every movement, some libertarians are big supporters of isolating China, big supporters of the crackdown on social media, and some libertarians, like the Mises Caucus, oppose it. Some Republicans are big supporters of the war in Ukraine and sending weapons, and think Julian Assange is a traitor to the country who needs to rot away in prison. And some Republicans are supporting him. And on every issue, and we see this in the left as well. I went to the May 1st demonstrations. I went to 3 of them yesterday. I went to the one just out there on Washington Square Park. I didn't see a single anti-war sign. I didn't see a single sign supporting the Uhuru movement. I didn't see a single sign, condemning the call for World War III. And that this is happening on the so-called left. And increasingly, the division is not about what ideology you profess. The division is very much about where you stand on the real issues that I would argue represent a real divide in the ruling class of the United States and the forces around the world that are contending for power. I don't have as much time here to get to many different things here, but I want to just say this. I remember when I first discovered the work of Ward Churchill. Right? Fox News was going after Ward Churchill, this top Native American scholar. And so I read his essay, Some People Push Back. And I, at the time, having grown up in a small town among conservatives, I thought it was a great essay. He was basically calling out how Americans are complicit and they don't go along with the crimes. They don't stand up and oppose the crimes of the U.S. government. And 9/11 was people around the world taking revenge on them or whatever. I thought it sounded so revolutionary at the time. And I look back on that now, and it's like if you look into Ward Churchill's history, Ward Churchill's career as the top American scholar really took off when he was the speechwriter for Russell Means. Russell Means was the leader of the American Indian movement, and Russell Means took a right-wing turn in the 1980s. And he went around the United States fundraising for the Contras of Nicaragua and arguing that the Sandinistas, the Marxists, were oppressing Native Americans, and that if you were an ally of Native Americans, it was your duty to help fund the Contra War and support Ronald Reagan. And Ward Churchill was his speechwriter and went with him to Nicaragua to write and make documentaries arguing the Sandinistas were oppressing indigenous people, and he went as far as arguing it was justified for indigenous people to take arms and weapons from the US government in order to fight the evil westernized Marxists who were trying to take them away from their sacred indigenous ways. And Ward Churchill's argument that he got so attacked for by Fox News, arguing that average Americans are no good and complicit in the crimes of the empire, it seemed ultra-revolutionary at the time. But if you really look at it, if you think about it from the perspective of kind of what Erin raised in her remarks about how essentially we have a situation here where they're trying to drive down living standards and the bulk of the population are viewed as an obstacle to doing so, you can see how arguments that average Americans are no good, that average Americans are the enemy, these things that have become really central in the teachings of the New Left in so many ways, anti-populism. If you look at Noel Ignatin, if you listen to the 1619 Project, the idea that average Americans are no good, the average Americans are the enemy, is a very useful thing for our elite to push. It's very useful for them as they look to drive down living standards, as they look to push us into an unpopular confrontation. Anti-war sentiment is higher than it's ever been, but we are being told that it is our moral responsibility to support escalating against Russia and China. And that, so much on the left, we think that attacking the Constitution, burning the US flag, these kinds of things, we think that this is so revolutionary. It feels so revolutionary. But in essence, it's serving the interests of the elite that are trying to disempower average Americans. It's interesting. You quoted Trotsky's essay about should America go communist? I actually quote that in my new book as well. It's actually, as I'm a critic of Trotskyism, not a big fan of Trotsky, but of all of Trotsky's works, it's probably the best I would recommend. And in that essay, he talks about how, just as somebody who was part of the Russian Revolution, socialism, when it comes to the United States, is going to be stamped by some American characteristics. It's going to be taking hold and putting a revolutionary spin on trends and feelings that are deeply embedded within U.S. culture. It's going to be giving a voice to aspects of the American people that are deeply embedded, that are at odds with the liberal order. And that it looks like, especially since the 1960s and the rise of the New Left, the attitude has been, well, let's just try to condemn the American people. Let's show that we're the good Americans. Let's offer our condemnation. Let's be glue in the keyhole. The rest of the people around are good sheep. They're good Germans, but we are moralistically pure, and we're going to prove to the world that we're right. This is anti-populism. But if you're actually serious about thinking about how we could get a socialist society out of Western capitalism, you're actually thinking about how the crisis we're currently facing could lead to something better. If you're thinking about how the danger of a new world war could be prevented, and if you're thinking about the mass alienation among the U.S. public that gave rise to events like January 6th, how that could be harnessed for something good rather than simply justifying a crackdown, etc., you need to be thinking about how we can tap into the feelings that are there among the American people and channel it in a good, anti-imperialist, progressive, optimistic direction. Thank you.
Sorry, the awkward weather was really bad. I'll just say a couple of things and then maybe raise some questions. Dan, I feel as though this, in way of interpreting Marx, where you say that he's not really talking about politics, he's talking about economics, it's a bit slippery. I mean, how do you deal with the fact that he does kind of speak explicitly about the question of the democratic republic? And the crisis of the democratic republic at this time, and the fact that the Confederacy in America is aligning itself not only against the free proletariat, but also against the legacy of the American Revolution itself, and that he's calling at the same time in Britain for not just for democracy, but to win the battle of democracy, which I don't think is democracy versus anti-democracy, but the question of what the meaning of the demand for democracy and capitalism will be, whether it will be led by the proletarian revolution or something else. And then I do also just wonder about this hard division that you're making between the French and the American Revolution. I mean, can it really be said that the French Revolution had no vision of the past? I don't want to go for the cheap shot that they just dressed in togas, but beyond that, Rousseau also has this language of the restoration of freedom that's been oppressed by civilization. And I don't think in either the case of, America or France, that means simply a restoration of the past. It points towards the future. And I think that's why Marx says, well, the American Revolution was the first statement of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And certainly Jefferson very much saw himself as an ally of the French Revolution and someone who was part and parcel of kind of the same historical trajectory. So I think we do have to kind of take up and at least try and understand why these people might have thought that about themselves. Caleb, your remarks make me think that one of the missing sort of perspectives here in terms of the discussion of this problem on the left today is that I think would be represented roughly by the present day Democratic Socialists for America, which also I think in some ways takes their cues from the Popular Front and points to FDR. And in doing so, they say, well, we do need to change the Constitution actually to be more democratic and to protect ourselves. So what do you make of the fact that the legacy of the Popular Front can lead to such sort of diametrically opposed political viewpoints? And I do want to raise this question of the Popular Front more broadly. I was reading Earl Browder's essay on the Constitution in preparation for this, just because I was trying to see, what have leftists in the past written about this. And in that essay, he talks about the need to support progressive democracy for a people's front against fascism. And that the Constitution is really in the way of FDR's reforms. And the People's Front, as it was conceived at the time, even by those who supported it and not by its critics, was felt to be a sort of step back from the goal of revolution and certainly from the goal of socialism that was non-identical. And so I think it does raise the old problem. I mean, whether one is for or against the People's Front raises an even older problem in Marxism, which is what is the relationship of socialism and Marxism to the demand for democracy, the political demand for democracy in society? Not just against Bonaparte's, because the important thing about Bonaparte, Louis Bonaparte, is that he was a socialist, and he came from the socialist movement in France, and he was democratically elected by the National Assembly from the Revolution, and then of course his coup was confirmed by democracy. And so I don't think we can just say that Bonaparte, the Bonapartist, is kind of the evil authoritarian, or however you conceive it, that's going to, whether Donald Trump or otherwise, that's going to oppress the people, but rather it poses the question of the self-contradiction of democracy, that the demand for democracy can be the democratic demand for authoritarianism, and that the relationship of socialism to democracy in that context needs to be clarified. And I feel as though that's what Marx and the Marxist project was in some regard trying to do through the class struggle. So I just wanted, the class struggle in France, that essay that he wrote. So I just wanted to kind of pose that question about, what is the meaning of the Popular Front? Because you both seem to agree, actually, that we should have FDR's reforms against the Constitution. Right? What do we learn from the experience of the Popular Front, and how does that point back to this broader question that we might take up, which is what's the relationship of socialism and of Marxism to the demand for democracy?
Well, yeah, since you posed a couple direct questions, could you, I guess you should probably respond, but please try to...
Yes, I'll give it very short. First of all, Marxist democracy. First of all, I doubt Marx ever read the U.S. Constitution. I've seen nothing that indicates he's actually has any interests or any knowledge of the actual mechanics of the workings of U.S. government, number one. When he talks about democracy, I think what he means is the absence of an aristocracy, a political / legal leveling where everyone is a citizen on the same legal basis, and in which there is a uniform bourgeois, political, cultural structure. In other words, an all civilian, non-aristocratic republic. So that's what I think he means by democracy. So in that sense, he would describe America pre-1861 as a democracy. He would hail the election of Lincoln, of course, as the fulfillment of this democracy, and he would, certainly hope that the constitutional struggle would go on to become a revolutionary struggle and a refounding of the American Republic on a completely new, radical basis. Number one. Number two, I strongly, wherever I go, I tell people to read Robert R. Palmer's magnificent work written from the two-volume study published in 1959 and second volume in 1964 called The Age of the Democratic Revolution, in which he deals with the paradoxes of the American Revolution. And he points out that the elements in the U.S. that supported the radical wing of the French Revolution were the diametric opposite of those in France and the continent, which were pro-Jacobin. In the U.S., the planters and the frontiersmen were pro-Jacobin, whereas the gentry in Europe, the landed gentry, was of course horrified by Jacobinism, and it was the urban tradesmen and the small businessmen and rising manufacturers and financiers who were most pro-Jacobin. The same elements in the U.S. who supported the Federalists and were pro-British and hostile to France. It's a comedy of errors in which the alignment in America is diametrically what the alignment is in France and the rest of the continent. And Jefferson's a classic example. I mean, Jefferson is a racist. He's a truly anti-urban, anti-industrial, racist, pro-slave, pro-states' rights. Yet he is fervently in favor of the radical wing of the French Revolution, and a Hamilton.
Doesn't Jefferson try and ban slavery? He introduces an amendment to the Constitution to ban slavery.
No.
Yes.
No.
It's not passed. Yes, he does.
I don't.
This is real. Look it up.
I will have to look it up. I know he introduced certain anti-slavery legislation in Virginia, but he fast abandoned that. And he and Madison, their party became the party of the Democratic Party of pro-slavery. Number one, anyway, Jefferson did give vent to certain seemingly radical statements, but he was, in all respects, a profoundly conservative figure, yet pro-Jacobin. And Hamilton, who was hostile to the Jacobins, pro-British, was anti-slave, an industrialist, a urbanizer, and also an anti-states' rights person who dreamed of breaking up Virginia into French-style départements. He was hostile to the Jacobins, and it's Palmer's thesis is that Hamilton was a unconscious Jacobin, and that Jefferson was really much closer to the conservative opposition. Anyway, I find that a very interesting and very important statement. And by the way, I don't agree with FDR. I'm not a popular frontist. I believe in a workers' front, not a popular front, not a popular front dominated by liberals, which essentially pushes socialism to the background. The CP stopped talking about socialism after 1935. It was all about liberalism and anti-fascism, but anti-fascism given a liberal spin. And socialism was pushed to the background, and then the CP became surprisingly conservative. You can even see that in the CP art of the late 30s. In any case, I'll leave it there. So that's overstated my time.
Okay, well, I'll be really quick because we got to open this up. But as far as Bonapartism, my understanding of Bonapartism is that it's a process. As capitalism enters a state of decay, the capitalists begin to fight with each other and battle each other for control of the state. One faction in the ruling class tries to seize control of the state and utilize the state in order to stabilize the economy and hold off the effects of the capitalist crisis. And then in order to do so, different factions emerge and they recruit working class people to be their foot soldiers. And they build a coalition outside of their own class to give them strength against members of their own class in order to impose their particular agenda of how to stabilize the capitalist crisis. And there are different factions contending for power, recruiting the working class. And what I put forward in my book is that that basically it is out of these kinds of divisions where the working class is brought into politics by figures in the ruling class that the working class discovers its own interests and learns how to fight, and that every Marxist revolution we've seen in history has begun as a struggle within the ruling class between various Bonapartist contending factions, but that has then opened the door to the working class asserting its own interests. And that Bonapartism is the natural result of capitalism and decay. Fascism is one particular form of Bonapartism, but there's also progressive Bonapartism like Roosevelt, FDR, like Louis Bonaparte. I mean, he built a lot of railroads and hospitals and a lot of things, but it wasn't socialism. That's what Marx points out. So there are different forms of Bonapartism, and that's what I view it. I view it as members of the capitalist class going outside their own class, building a coalition, and trying to use that coalition to assert their will and stabilize capitalism. I mean, as far as something else I wanted to, Earl Browder. You know, I have actually studied a lot of Earl Browder's work, and I wish more people would, because if you're interested in building socialism in the United States, you ought to be studying people who've done it before. In a lot of ways, I've learned a lot from Earl Browder's work, but I would say, you know, I mean, ultimately, the way he completely caved during the Second World War, dissolved the Communist Party, basically, you know, completely abandoned Marxism. I mean, I would consider myself a student of William C. Foster, who was his greatest rival. But I've learned a lot from Browder's work, and one thing I would say is that I find his work on the American Revolution to be very weak. And I would argue, I mean, he refers to the Hamiltonian counter-revolution, you know, and that actually, I actually think that's one of the good things that we've seen in the last few years in terms of Marxist scholarship is that, it used to be in Browder champions Jefferson, you know, and portrays Hamilton as the counter-revolutionary, and thanks to the work of Christian Parenti and others, there's actually been a flip, and I think that Hamilton and others, you know, represented the more progressive wing of the American Revolution. But ultimately, you know, I do consider the tradition that I come out of to be, you know, from the tradition of William C. Foster and the Communist Party before it was basically destroyed at its 1957 convention, inheritor of the new communist movement of the 1970s, and largely what I'm trying to do with Center for Political Innovation is kind of get out of the movement and get to the masses and kind of reinforce this understanding that this counterculture left that originated as an attempt to distort Marxism during the Cold War with the Congress for Cultural Freedom program and other things, and then became a vehicle during the 1970s and 80s and 90s for carrying out color revolutions around the world, destabilizing anti-imperialist governments, has now been brought home. The color revolution apparatus has been brought home. And it is now trying to impose some kind of very dangerous and fascistic Bonapartist regime on the United States to stabilize capitalism in crisis. And while many of the people who are opposed to it call themselves libertarians or conservatives or whatnot, that should be the main focus, is defeating that particular woke fascism that is trying to impose itself on the United States at this time. And that's how I see things.
All right, thank you guys. So now we'll take questions. So if anybody has any questions, this is microphone work.
Try tapping it.
So it seems, yeah, this is what we feedback.
Thank you. This is a great forum. It was a retired treasurer. A couple of things. It's clear the Constitution is a pretty strong document. It survived the Civil War. And of course, the Confederates themselves said that it was the Union that violated the Constitution, and that we need to preserve the Constitution. But I do agree with Dan that there are elements within the Constitution itself that should be addressed, and it's problematic, like you talked about the electoral college and the fact that it's very difficult to amend the Constitution. But I think there's another element that is more a bigger factor that's undermining our constitutional rights. And there are forces that are in play that are driving foreign policy that are hidden, that do things with gangster methods to carry out a particular agenda. We saw this through the various assassinations that have taken place between John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, and also the manipulation of Congress to establish even further back the Federal Reserve and attempts to get our government into World War I. The role of the Rothschilds and Morgans to arm England secretly without the knowledge of the American public. that is more of a threat than the actual Constitution itself. And we're seeing that being played out now with the color revolutions. You see that domestically in international politics with the United States, but I even see this here in New York City with attempts to close down Rikers Island, saying that you can close down Rikers, you can defund the police in order for developers to take control of Rikers Island. And we know it's been catastrophic. And I'm dealing with that directly, I want to talk about that, because I deal with that directly in my community. And the housing crisis being manipulated by demagogues, paid groups that include, the Soros foundations, paid individuals to say like this is a housing crisis. We need, we need rent control. We need rent regulation. We need good cause evictions. These are elements that are paid elements. So is bribery democratic? That's the question that we have to ask. And that's what's happening right now. We have institutions, a lot of nonprofits that are being paid off by these foundations. Is that a form of democracy that undermines our constitutional rights? So I mean, these are things that I feel are very strongly determining what's happening and undermining our Constitution, as opposed to what's in the document itself.
How do we do this?
Yeah, you can respond.
Okay. I agree with a lot of what you say, but I just point out that a period of of democratic breakdown, where essentially accountability is vanishing, and the functions of government retreat behind closed doors out of the view of the people. This becomes a wonderful playground for all kinds of oligarchic forces to work behind the scenes, to spend money, to do favors, to obtain favors. Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. The more undemocratic it becomes, the less visible it becomes to the people, and the less accountable it becomes to the people.
Of course, is the control of the media, the press.
Yes.
So the amount of information that one gets is very much dominated and controlled. So you really can't have true democratic discussion because the amount of information, censorship is there.
Yeah, the only thing I disagree with you when you talk about constitutional rights, I mean, what rights are we talking about? The right to shoot your neighbor's family because he objects to your shooting off your AR-15 in the middle of the night? I mean, is the Second Amendment a constitutional right we should defend? So my question is that constitutional rights we should talk about democratic rights, and those are rights which the people create democratically, not in 1787, but today in 2023, we decide what are the rights that we value, that we want to uphold, and that we will collectively defend. But I wouldn't include the right to bear arms in that category. I wouldn't include the right to free speech, the right to a free press, the right to one person, one vote, the right to sexual freedom, to bodily autonomy as much as possible within certain very broad parameters, etc. So I mean, it's up to us to create democratically those rights that we want to uphold and defend. So rather than constitutional rights, I would talk about democratic rights with a small d, by the way.
I have no response. I think take more questions.
All right, you have a question?
Yeah. Thank you, and thank Platypus, and I'm very glad that we're thinking about the questions of the left in terms of history and American history in particular for us here. I think first of all, the word Constitution is itself already ambiguous and a problem. Just to lift that document out and make it so central and so forth, because Constitution also means the whole body of British common law and all of the Supreme Court decisions, all of the laws, even traditions and so forth. When we talk about the American Constitution, we're not just talking about those few pages. So, that's just one thing to think about. I don't know if anyone here knows who Vernon Parrington was, but he was a historian of American literature, and he was a great populist. And he said that the discovery that the Constitution, in the narrower sense, is a conservative document, was the great discovery of the progressive era, referring to Charles Beard's book, The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, which was written, published in 1916, and which demonstrated the extent to which the Constitution was a creation of debt owners, commercial classes, planters, and so forth. However, when I think about the history of the American left, which is in many ways glorious, when I think about the achievements of the American people, it has all been done with and, in a sense, through modifying the Constitution, in the literal Constitution. And I would think of three examples. First of all, when they put the Constitution in, it was opposed by the democratic forces, which were at that point with state legislatures and so forth. That was the anti-federalists, and they only got it through by the adoption of the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights, of course, we all know that the Second Amendment is a problem, and reserving things to the states is a problem, but the Bill of Rights is fantastic. The proclamation, and it has been. Why are we able to have this meeting right now? Why can we say we want to overthrow the American government? Because the anti-federalists modified the Constitution. That is part of the Constitution. Those rights, freedom of speech, and so forth are part of the Constitution. The abolition of slavery was done under the Constitution. When Britain abolished slavery, it recompensed the slave owners. We didn't do that. If we could take the slaves, if we could, expropriate the slaves, we could expropriate the banks under the Constitution as well. There is nothing in the Constitution, that would prevent that. And we passed, especially, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, especially the 14th Amendment, which puts the force of the federal government to protect every individual's rights in every state and so forth, which is what the whole civil rights movement is based upon. I was in Freedom Summer. The whole idea of Freedom Summer was to force the federal government to uphold the 14th Amendment in Mississippi and so forth. And then finally, Roosevelt and so forth. Roosevelt's enemy was not the Constitution. Roosevelt's enemy was the Supreme Court, and only for a couple of years, and when a few people died, then we got the Warren Court. So the constitutional achievements of the New Deal are not only the fact that we can regulate business, which, they had argued under the Constitution you couldn't, but there was a constitutional revolution that said we can regulate business. Business rights are not absolute. Obviously, they're trying to push it back now, and so forth. But also criminal rights. Making sure that everybody had a lawyer. Desegregation, voting rights. That was all part of the achievements of the Warren Court, which was something that the New Deal accomplished. So these are three really kind of incredible moments: the anti-federalists, the abolition of civil war, the abolition of slavery during the Civil War, the violent abolition of slavery during the Civil War, and then the New Deal revolution, which extends into the 60s, and the Warren Court. These are three moments in which the Constitution, our Constitution, was modified in a positive direction.
Well, I would say I agree with a lot of what you said. And
I agree with a lot of what you said.
And I also, I do agree with Dan to some extent. The Constitution isn't magic, all right? The Constitution isn't like this sacred, holy document that if we change it, oh my God, this is our, we get it, right? But at the same time, I think, in some of Dan's remarks, he said that he didn't see a division within the ruling class, and he saw the Bonapartism coming from Trump. Trump is down for the count. I mean, those folks are bleeding out right now. I mean, those folks are, in terms of the security state and the apparatus of government and the media. I mean, Tucker Carlson just got removed from Fox News, and I mean, it's like we're at the point that most of the Republican camp is against him, and that that, I mean, yes, he's clinging to the grievances of a very large section of the U.S. population that is alienated from U.S. society. But in terms of within the government apparatus and within the policing agencies and even within the Pentagon, he's quite weak. And, you know, who was aligned with Trump? I mean, look at the people that were aligned with him. They were capitalists, but they weren't part of the club, you know? I mean, Betsy DeVos is a great example. Billionaire, yeah, where does their money come from? It comes from Amway, from the Tupperware, you know, multi-level marketing scam. And her brother is Eric Prince of Blackwater, the military contracting company. You know, who is a company that was a big supporter of Donald Trump's? Hobby Lobby. I mean, you think Hobby Lobby is that who's controlling our government right now? For example, the Koch brothers, right? You know, Rachel Maddow would rant against the Koch brothers night after night after night. Well, the Koch brothers and the fracking companies are quite weak compared to the big four super major oil companies, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. And that Trump, to some degree or other, represented the lower level capitalists who saw Obama as cutting into their interests and trying to stabilize the U.S. economy in the aftermath of the financial crisis and imposing regulations that would benefit the ultra monopolies and crush them. And that while Trump's rhetoric certainly appealed to anti-immigrant bigotries and many things that were reprehensible, at the end of the day, Trump's presidency was largely defensive. He came in to try and protect the lower levels of capital from the big monopolies and their particular agenda of trying to stabilize the United States during a crisis. And at this point, if you look at the way things are playing out on the global stage, the ultra monopolies at this point, I mean, you talk about the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum, they have a vision for crushing Russia, crushing China, crushing the Bolivarian countries, crushing the axis of resistance, but also crushing the lower levels of capital here at home. And that creates the opening for a united front. If you look at the Chinese flag, what does the Chinese flag stand for? It stands for a popular front. Right, you have the big star, that's the Communist Party, but then the four other stars are the block of four classes that the communists unified against the Western imperialists, against the big ultra monopolies that dominate the planet. The workers, the peasants, the middle peasantry, the small farmers, and the national bourgeoisie. And there's a potential for a block of different classes or a block of resistance, an anti-monopoly coalition, is what William Z. Foster called it, to be formed in the United States right now, against the drive for World War III, against the suppression of civil liberties, against tech censorship, and against the big monopolies that are behind all of this. Sure.
Okay, well, I just want to ask, I mean, so we're all just okay with ditching the Second Amendment? I mean, I wonder what you guys would think of somebody like Rosa Luxemburg, who thought that, you know, the proletariat needs to arm themselves. And, you know, people always say stuff like, what's your arms going to do against a nuclear bomb? I mean, let's be real. It's not about fighting the war apparatus of the state. It's about things like the cops. It's about other armed militias in civil society. It's about the right to organize oneself for revolutionary action and also to defend oneself. And by the way, the Second Amendment doesn't give anybody the right to just shoot people with impunity. That's, I think, a bit ridiculous. But, you know, I think this idea that was raised from the audience, that the great discovery of the progressive era was that the Constitution is a conservative document, is actually like a very important point and seems to shape the history that we're talking about. You know, the progressive era is also the counter-revolution against the revolution. That's like part of what it is. It's the taking up of democratic demands for the continuation of capitalism for now over 100 years, right? The idea that it's Wilson's or Lenin's peace. I mean, all of this is part of the political landscape of the time. And so what does it mean that the progressive era discovered that the Constitution is conservative, and is socialism identical, or should it be equated with progressivism? What is actually the difference if we're saying that there's some sort of different point of view that's being taken up here? I think that was raised by the question.
Can I just say that I was the one that Harrington, the Constitution is the enemy, in my view, of populism. It is. It is not the enemy of socialism. I mean, it would like to be, but I mean, you know, it is not necessarily the enemy of socialism. Socialism and populism are not necessarily the same thing. This is the discussion I want other people want to talk.
I just wanted to get in my 2 cents worth about that. you and I are completely opposed.
I'm glad we agree on that.
I'm an anti-Beardy.
The anti what?
Beardy.
Uh-huh.
I think that Beard's interpretation of the Constitution was a populist in the worst sense of the word. The Constitution was not some kind of con by rich people to pull the wool out over the eyes of the little people in this silly Howard Zinn style. The Constitution actually was a significant democratic advance in that it opened up for the first time a democratic theater encompassing the entire country as a whole. Now, it was flawed. There are 1,000 things wrong with it. But the creation of a common democratic arena was a stunning advance. Common nationwide democratic arena. That was what, that strengthened the anti-slavery forces, because it meant that the South couldn't carry on their own, in their own separate territory. It meant that everything that happened was under the common democratic purview. That was not some con that was put forth by the evil Hamilton. That was a great advance. And I think Beard, he's radically unsound. And the Anti-Federalists were not in any way progressive. They were the states' rightists of their day. Many of them were pro-slavery, especially in the South. The abolition, the three Civil War amendments, the paradox is that those constitutional amendments were force bills that were adopted unconstitutionally by stretching Article 5 beyond recognition. States were required, in fact, in the case of Tennessee, they were actually forced to approve, I think it was the 14th Amendment, literally at gunpoint. So these were force bills. They were extra constitutional. So the Constitution, in this great moment, had to be modified from the outside through extra constitutional means. So you can't credit that to the Constitution.
But that's normal.
And
that is how constitutions are modified.
No, it's not. There's a constitutional process. In this case, the machinery had broken down so much that people were forced to take emergency measures and impose change from without.
The states were outside, and that's why they were able to.
Yeah,
Yes.
and they were readmitted on a condition they would approve the amendments.
I mean, but then would you say that the Constitution is going to be amended by procedure and not by revolution and organization and civil society? I feel like that's what is being raised from the audience.
Well, yes, that's what happened, but don't credit the Constitution with the fact that these extraordinary measures had to be taken to impose change upon this unresponsive document. And the Warren Court. Of course, the Warren Court. It was a quasi-revolutionary force. That's undoubtedly correct. But now we're seeing the unwinding of that process. We've seen the repeal of Roe v. Wade. We're seeing the court being returning. We're seeing that the period from 1938 essentially to 1973 was actually the great exception in American history, and the court is now reverting to its traditional role as a bulwark of conservatism and of anti-democracy. So rather than somehow justifying the Constitution, it really shows its increasingly regressive anti-democratic quality now. And finally, Aaron, but the Second Amendment, just really fast. An individual right to bear arms is the opposite of a workers' militia. Workers in a workers' militia do not own their arms. The arms are held by the working class in common. The purpose of a workers' militia is to impose a monopoly on violence. A workers' militia must disarm the American population, concentrate all weapons in the ownership of the working class, the collective ownership.
But the American population has to have weapons for them to be disarmed by the proletariat. If they're disarmed by the capitalist state, I mean, what are we talking about?
The process of working class revolution in which Red Guards a working class army is formed, and the working class army then essentially imposes a monopoly on violence and essentially disarms all non-proletarian elements. And the proletarian arms are owned collectively, not individually. The Second Amendment is the diametric opposite of a workers' militia as conceived by Luxemburg or Trotsky.
Maybe I'll just chime in on that a little bit. You know, the debate around gun control in leftist circles is a bit outdated because, you know, in the 1930s, you had fascist groups that were going around shooting down workers on the picket line. The question was, do we call for the government to protect the striking workers, or do we form our own workers' militia? And in the 1960s, black people were defending themselves against the police and, you know, et cetera. And it was, do we call for gun control, or do we allow people to defend themselves? The mass shootings of today are not fascist militias. The mass shootings of today are not the context of the 1960s. And, you know, I really empathize with parents who are afraid that they're going to get the call that their child came home from school dead, right? And so I don't want to go around screaming from the heavens about the workers' right to own guns and et cetera. But at the same time, you know, I mean, this notion that the capitalist state is going to keep everyone safe is quite an illusion. This notion that somehow, this notion that somehow, you know, gun ownership is racist, or defending the Second Amendment is the equivalent of defending hate crimes, that's ridiculous. And that ultimately, you know, in a lot of parts of the United States, gun ownership is just a really big part of life. And many Americans do see it as a very big attack on their freedoms, and they don't trust the government. And I just, while I'm not going to scream from the heavens, and I'm certainly not going to try and frame it as the 1930s debate or the 1960s debate, I'm not excited about revoking the Second Amendment at all.
If you have a new constitution, you automatically revoke the Second Amendment. If you have a new constitution, the Second Amendment is revoked. You create a new constitution from scratch. Sure. And if you decide to put a Second Amendment in there, it'll be contextually very different. And I fully doubt, that any modern democratic force, Democratic Constituent Assembly, would recreate this horror of a right to bear arms, which is causing catastrophe in our society, and is essentially the rallying cry of the far right militias.
Let's take another question. Let's get your question.
I just want to respond to that. So, like, what's to say then that those that do own the majority of guns in this country or these far right leaning militias wouldn't just use their guns to, I don't know, attack that principle? Like, I don't really see.
Revolution means civil war. I mean, revolution, you've got to seize power, and you've got to establish your power, and that means you've got to eliminate any opposition. And if people
establish it if all these guns already exist.
Well, these guns don't. I mean, all these middle-aged, pot-bellied guys in Texas with AR-15s are going to be, you know, are not a military force of any significance. I mean, a democratic revolutionary state would have to essentially, seize the state, seize the armed forces, and establish its own power. This is what revolutions do. It's happened in France in the 1790s, and it happened in Russia in 1970 to 21. You've got to establish your power. And if some guy, if some Second Amendment nut wants to come at you with an AR-15, he'd be very foolish to do that, in which you would pass laws saying you must relinquish your arms. By the way, a monopoly of violence doesn't mean that people can't own weapons. It means that weapons must be regulated. I mean, shouldn't that be obvious? I mean, you can't. That weapons should be regulated. Weapons can only be owned with the express permission of the democratic state, and that the state established the conditions for owning weapons.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't seem to me feasible given the amount of guns and, like, quote unquote Second Amendment nuts that there are in this country.
There are a lot of Second Amendment nuts.
But today, doesn't that mean that the capitalist state is the one regulating gun ownership? Isn't that the elephant in the room? I mean, the state we have is the capitalist state.
The capitalist state is not going to do that. The capitalist state is now dominated by far right-wing elements who essentially see the Second Amendment as every bit as important as the First Amendment.
Are these people elected Joe Biden?
No, but they dominate the Supreme Court. They control the House. They are disproportionately powerful in the Senate. They dominate thinking in the federal judiciary, increasingly the state judiciaries as well. I mean, the New York gun control laws, which say I mean, the courts are about to impose a Texas-style free carry law in New York, where you have a constitutional right to carry a 6-gun onto the subway. And if someone looks at you wrong, you know how to take care of it. I mean, this is not democratic. This is a break, and the constitutional structure, insanely enough, is essentially endorsing this point of view. Our Supreme Court is endorsing this point of view. I mean, what the irony is that the seminal article on the Second Amendment was published in 1989 in the Yale Law Review by a sterling liberal named Sanford Levinson. And he was the one who wrote this article saying, look, there's more to this amendment that liberals want to admit. And that essentially started a revolution in which we now know that the right to bear arms, the individual right to bear arms, is deeply ensconced in this profoundly reactionary pre-modern document known as the U.S. Constitution.
I need to say something quickly, which is what you just said about revolution meaning civil war is something I vehemently disagree with. I believe that responsible revolutionaries historically have always advocated a peaceful transition to proper democratic procedures. If violent revolutions break out, that is because the power structure has broken down democratic rights to the point that people have to defend themselves. The Bolshevik Revolution happened because of the Kornilov reaction. Mao Zedong wanted a coalition government with Chiang Kai-shek, and that there's nothing more anti-populist, anti-working class than going around advocating that people's country be torn apart by civil war. We should advocate a peaceful transition to socialism. If the ruling power structure won't allow it and people are forced to defend themselves, that's a different situation. But especially in light of all the allegations and stuff floating around about violent revolution and foreign subversion and all that, we must be abundantly clear. We advocate a peaceful and democratic transition to socialism.
Absolutely correct. But we also recognize that a socialist revolution means the socialist transformation of the state, and it means that we take the state apparatus we place it under socialist control, which includes a military, etc. And the first duty of that apparatus is to secure the revolution. Now, of course, you're absolutely correct. It's the right wing which will be violent, but the revolution will be forced to defend itself. But the revolution will be forced to establish a monopoly on state power. And that monopoly on state power means a monopoly on armed force.
Well, I'll just tell you this. In Libya, during the counter-revolution backed by NATO and Obama, Gaddafi's socialist government was so popular that they were driving through the streets just handing guns out to the population to defend themselves. And the only way the so-called rebels were victorious is because they had foreign backing. Gaddafi and his socialist government was popular they could arm the population.
Gaddafi was not a socialist.
Anyway. Well, Islamic socialism. Read the Green Book, the first book the Center for Political Innovation published. So there you go.
Let's get this question. Aaron? Aaron, you.
Michael's had his hand up.
Two questions. Yeah, see this question. So Aaron first, then Michael.
Sure. I guess my question, I think it's come up several times. The panel has been the Popular Front. I know, like, for example, Earl Browder in the 30s, Communist Party really said communism is 20th century Americanism, or that or the other way around. I thought it was interesting earlier that Dan had an objection to that. Dan said that this kind of Americanism of the Communist Party at the time is the way that subordinated itself to FDR and the New Deal and the Popular Front, and how the Communist Party abandoned its like aims of revolution and that kind of thing. I know also, because Keel talked about context in the New Left and aftermath of the New Left, a kind of like anti-liberalism is the way that a lot of the left ends up sort of subordinating itself to the progressive liberalism of its time. And so I guess like maybe like the larger questions, kind of like progressivism, kind of the way that the discontents of capitalism emerge, and how if like the Constitution is an 18th century document, the bourgeois revolution is something that preceded the Industrial Revolution. And so the way that this kind of gets taken up in the progressive age era, industrial revolution becomes much more vexed the tradition of revolution and state revolution. And so I just wanted to ask, what is the relationship of Marxist left to the progressive capitalist politics, and how exactly does the issue of the bourgeois revolution kind of fit into this? And again, the Marxist.
Is that directed at anybody, or you want to?
I kind of want you to answer it, because I was curious about your remark.
Let's get Michael's question as well. Please speak up a little.
Yeah, my question is specifically related to the question of democracy and its relation to socialism. And that it also touches a little bit on this idea of bonapartism that you mentioned. So one of the, I'm sorry, I'm not too clear with the names, but some mention that bonapartism is this elitist fights within each other using the middle lower capitalists as fodder to fuel their fights, and then usually out of that the lower workers realize that potential for et cetera, et cetera. But as I have learned out of this, bonapartism is specifically a crisis of democracy, and that it is the workers asking for, is workers demanding liberalism. That is like, well, just to clarify better, that is part of the crisis of the Constitution that I think Eric was pointing out, that it being the crisis of bourgeois society, that I think generally that the Constitution was written in the spirit of classic liberalism or whatever. And so when we look at the failures of classic liberalism, we see like that is where the potential of the Constitution ends, where the failures of liberalism begin. Right, of slavery, black suffrage, et cetera, and all those issues. And so one of the key issues that I think is held in this pen is like, you're arguing democratic revolution, et cetera. You're arguing democratic constitution, et cetera, and they both mean entirely different things. And so the issue in and of itself that I think that Marx and Engels were pointing out specifically with democracy as the mechanism or the tool for the tool for bringing about socialism, also points that the Constitution to the left perhaps is specifically also a tool, not in the sense of like the sacredness that we try to imbue it with, but if you recognize socialism as a continuation of the bourgeois revolution where it failed, then that is how the tool has managed to be used politically. And one of the things we're not mentioning is it's not exactly what the popular sovereignty is, because Marx and Engels specifically talk about the problem of democracy in that case. It's the conversations that are had within democracy that shape it to be within this capitalist context. Whether we have democracy as a democratic constitution or as a democratic revolution, so long as it is within the capitalist order, it is the same capitalist democracy that we have now. And so the issue specifically isn't, are we having a democratic constitution, or is everyone participating, blah, 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 popular sovereignty, because we're not really tackling what is the constitution to, as the question that asked the first question, of what is the Marxist position on the role of the constitution in furthering the goal of socialism as, you believe Marx understood, as you understand it, etc.
Should I do it? Yeah, go ahead. Okay. To the first speaker, first of all, the Popular Front was an alliance of communists with a capital C and liberals in support of Roosevelt, and in an attempt to forge a broad alliance with liberals against fascism. Trotsky counterposed to that the idea of a workers' front, where the working class steps forward and opposes itself to liberalism and fascism, and says you can't fight fascism with a rotten liberalism, because the breakdown, the collapse of liberalism is what's laying the basis for fascism. Remember, in Germany in 1933, it was the centrist parties, the liberal parties, which made Hitler chancellor. believed they could control him, but they handed power to Hitler, even at a time when his electoral support was actually declining. So so it was the liberals who handed power to the Nazis, and you would need a workers' united front based on the working class, which is the great majority of the population, putting forward a program of revolutionary socialism and revolutionary democracy. And revolutionary democracy means it doesn't mean the fragmented semi-democracy we have now, checks and balances, a Senate, a House, a Supreme Court, etc. I mean, to put it in purely mechanical terms, it means a single revolutionary assembly or constituent assembly, which is a historical correct term, elected by one person, one vote, on the basis of proportional representation, with total power to revamp society from top to bottom. If the constituent assembly says, for now on, you will hold your fork in your left hand rather than your right hand, that is the power of the constituent assembly to do that. Of course, there's no reason it would, but its power would be unchecked. Its only power would be its only check would be its own judgment as to what constitutes democracy. And the bourgeoisie will never grant that kind of democracy because it doesn't want to hand power to the great majority of the population that is that is the working class. And consequently, they want to see popular power broken up, pitted against each other, through checks and balances, and therefore self-nullified. But socialists stand for a revolutionary democracy in which society in general, led by the working class, is able to completely reconstruct society from the very ground up. And not only society, by the way, but economics, culture, morality, science and philosophy, etc. So that's the kind of revolution, and we want it on a global basis as well. And so that is the kind of revolutionary democracy that revolutionary socialism stands for. And I think in an era of global warming and a growing threat of war, that is clearly the only democratic alternative that we have.
I'd like to say that I think the Popular Front, as critical, and there's room for criticism of it, absolutely, but it was the period in American history where Marxism and communism had the greatest influence. And it's also the period of the greatest victories for our working class. And that, yes, it was an alliance, because there was a Bonapartist struggle in the ruling class, an alliance with the Roosevelt coalition against the National Association of Manufacturers, against the allies of the Axis powers. And it was an alliance with forces that were progressive, but what it meant to be progressive was very different back then than it is now. For example, Roosevelt was all about growth. He was building highways, he was building bridges, he was electrifying parts of this country. The progressive movement now thinks that growth is bad, and they say so, and they're pushing degrowth in the name of Marxism as hard as they possibly can. Another great thing about the Popular Front was it was a very, very anti-racist movement. And the CIO, when it expanded as a union, it was multiracial. And it said to white workers, racism hurts you. By having a whites-only union, that enables a situation when there's a strike that the black people are used as scab labor. But if you open up your union and make it multiracial and make the demands of your strike that black people be able to work in the factory alongside you, by raising up the conditions and the demands of the oppressed, you can open up victories for the entire working class. And that was the perspective that was put forward. And now, if you listen to voices that claim to speak in the name of anti-racism, their message is that racism benefits white workers. They should just feel guilty and ashamed of it. It's a very different kind of message. And that what it meant to be a progressive back then, what it means to be a progressive now are contrary things, right? Aligning with Roosevelt was not the equivalent of aligning with Joe Biden. That's just not the situation. Aligning with Roosevelt would be the equivalent of aligning with like a Trump or a figure who's vehemently fighting against the majority of his own class in order to hold on to power. Or a Bernie Sanders. Yes, he was fighting against the majority of the capitalist class in order to hold on to power. Whereas Biden represents the majority of the capitalist class trying to stabilize the system and drive down living conditions and marches into World War III. So these are completely different things. But there's so much. There's piles of literature written about the Communist Party during the Popular Front. They sold out this question. They sold out that question. Let's get a look at the bigger picture. Has there ever been a moment in American history where communism and Marxism was so influential? Has there ever been a president other than Roosevelt who was so friendly to the Soviet Union, so friendly to Marxists and trade unionists? I mean, that was a moment that there's way more we can learn from in terms of achievements from that period than there is we can learn from in terms of failures. Not that there weren't big mistakes that were made, especially when the war broke out. The Communist Party really took a very...
Stalin tax.
Well,
a big mistake.
It was. I mean, Trotsky supported it. I mean, he said they had the right to do it. He didn't support the grounds on which they promoted it. He said they had the right to do it, and he said he would have called for it earlier.
He didn't support it.
He said they would have called for it even earlier, actually. And the Pact of '39, in a lot of ways, enabled the Soviet Union to eventually win the war and buy time. So there you go.
I mean, on the question, Michael, of democracy, there's a quote from Engels that Lenin mentions in State and Revolution, which is that democracy is still a state. This comes up also in the critique of the Gotha program, where they have some writing about a free state. They have a demand for a free state. And Marx says there's no such thing as a free state. Marxism agreed, in a sense, with anarchism, that the goal is to overcome democracy and to overcome the state. Nevertheless, they believed that the presence of the state and the Bonapartist state within capitalism was necessary and not simply accidental. So you can't make the revolution simply by ignoring state power, but you have to work through state power. And so Bonapartism is the negative image of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is a phenomenon of the failure of the proletariat to lead and the inability of the bourgeois revolution to lead. And that's kind of the crisis of capitalism. It's a historical crisis, right? It's not just class against class in this group and that group and all the different sociological categories. It's about historical trajectories and the fact that society seems to, in the name of freedom and in the name of democracy, undermine itself, right? Bourgeois fanatics for order shot down in their balconies in the name of order. And so what I think has been lost in this discussion is the question of why it is that Marxism was not simply democracy, right? That the dictatorship of the proletariat isn't about realizing democracy in some sort of better constitution or better state, but taking up and overcoming the crisis of democracy, or how democracy is itself a symptom of the crisis of freedom in capitalism. And so the demand to unwind or change or transform the Constitution, to undo the Constitution in certain respects, is made in the name of democracy. And you have this even in a strange way in the Civil War, right, with the South talking about states' rights. So even there, it's kind of present. And the feeling I get from this discussion is that we have a sort of disagreement, a fight within progressivism about what the meaning and trajectory of progressivism as the demand for the democratization of the state under capitalism today, which is represented by, on the one hand, things that you hear often, I think, for the Democratic Party, that we need to expand democracy by getting rid of gerrymandering or all these other sorts of things so that we can meet things like the climate crisis. Or on the other hand, the complaint that progressivism has come to be racialist, that it's come to deride civil liberties, that is now being expressed by people like Tulsi Gabbard or Matt Taibbi or many on the left. And so within that context, the question of what progressivism is, its historical emergence, and its relationship to Marxism, and why Marxism would have ever considered itself something other than simply the demand for democracy within the context of the capitalist state, it seems to me that it's a bit lost. And thus we get all of these different kind of arguments about Hamilton versus Jefferson, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if that answered your question, Michael.
Okay, we're running out of time. Let's take a final set of questions if anybody has anything. looks like they're just okay. So let's get Athene, you, and Jack.
All right. I kind of have a few questions, I suppose. Firstly, Dan, I wanted to pose this question regarding what you say the Constitution is being fundamentally racist. I take issue with this characterization, primarily because, I mean, at the time of its signing, you have, the famous 3/5 clause included in the Constitution. But I mean, amongst other things, these were originally, included as a kind of compromise between, the northern delegates and the southern delegates. And originally, the famous 3/5 clause, for instance, was designed to limit the political power of slaveholders who wanted every slave to be counted as a person for census purposes. But beyond that, I think the fathers seem to acknowledge that at the time of the Constitution's drafting, civil society seemed to be, by its own trajectory, be phasing out slavery. It wasn't until the technological and social demands of capital that we see the relationship of land and labor come into a contradiction in the expansion of the so-called Cotton King planter class in the South. And so I guess I want to pose, how then do you justify the Constitution being quote unquote fundamentally racist to some extent? And do we only see it that way because to some extent our view of the relationship of civil society to the state has become kind of lost? Because you also said this, that the Constitution defines every aspect of our lives, which seems already to exceed something to Bonapartism, namely that the law and the state serves a kind of positive function in structuring our lives. Caleb, I have a question that you claim we need to pragmatically defend the Constitution in this moment, contrasting that with the Communist Party in the 30s, the Popular Front, opposing the Constitution. But I guess I'd also ask, wasn't this Popular Front communism of the 30s also instrumental in the liquidation of the broad socialist movement in America into the FDR Democrats along Moscow party lines? So just kind of, what are your thoughts on these?
My question has to do with earlier remarks made about a peaceful transition to socialism. I wanted to ask, how do we think this is going to be possible when we see in the past we had characters like Eugene Debs and the tactics that were used against him, unlawfully thrown in prison, and the same liberal and democratic laws that we follow today and that we are using against people like Donald Trump, like any other figure, Hillary Clinton with her emails? Who is to say that those laws will not be used against the socialists if the task of revolution is taken up again in the future? And on the Second Amendment, how do we protect ourselves from the capitalist democracy if no one has the right to bear arms besides the government? Even though the government is, yes, a giant military machine, and I believe, as Dan put it, a bunch of pot-belly men in Texas would not be able to overcome the U.S. government. If we have no written right to bear arms, and we want to overcome all of the amendments in the Constitution, how can you overcome the Constitution without going through it? How can we have a peaceful transition of power when the government is going to use its military machine against us, just as it used it against people like Eugene Debs? If arms are to be regulated instead of simply banned, who will be doing the regulating? Wouldn't that open the door for corruption in the future? And I guess, those are my questions.
Right. Shall I go first?
There's one more.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I feel like Anthony sort of got at some of my question. I was going to go back all the way to the beginning, where Caleb, you spoke about different lines on the Constitution functioning differently in different contexts. So in the 50s, it was right to defend the Constitution, and in the 30s, it was right to criticize it for violations. And Dan, you seem to justify some of your remarks on this basis as well. The Second Amendment nuts. In other words, is the question of the Constitution simply a kind of tactical question for the left? Caleb, one way of understanding your remarks is that there's a kind of populist coalition that could be tactically intersected by the left in order to build a movement towards communism, and that right now that looks like defending the Constitution. right? And so what I wanted to ask was, is it just a tactical question? And if so, what accounts for the changes in context that change that tactical question, right? What accounts for the fracturing, the many different ostensibly left attitudes one can take on the question of the Constitution throughout the last at least 100 years? Why has it become fractured in this way? What is the status of the question of the Constitution for the left? Is it simply a line? Why does it matter?
You want to go first?
And, our closing remarks will be separate from this. Or
I think at this rate we should just like address all these questions in the last 50 minutes.
Okay, so we're just addressing those questions.
Yeah, I
and then
mean,
we're done.
Yeah.
Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, let's do that.
If you have something else to say that's unrelated, I think, go for it.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, the first question that was directed toward me about the Communist Party dissolving the broader socialist movement. If you read, there's a very good pamphlet by William Z. Foster published during the height of the Popular Front called The Crisis in the Socialist Party. And it really showed that if you were serious about socialism in America, serious about the labor movement and all of that, you found a way to be aligned with the Roosevelt administration or friendly to the Communist Party. And the forces within the broader socialist movement who didn't, who remained in the Socialist Party or grouped with the Trotskyites, were largely intellectuals who had no interest in that to begin with. And that largely, I mean, when events take place in the country, when there's a real polarization like there was around Roosevelt's leadership, that forces people to choose sides. And I don't think it was a question of the Communist Party dissolving the broader socialist movement. It was that the broader socialist movement found a way to work with Roosevelt and the Communist Party, or found a way to isolate itself and become kind of an intellectual grouping, a lot of which ended up becoming neoconservatives after the Second World War. The second question that was directed toward me was about a peaceful transition. Would that be possible with the repressive laws? We should expect these repressive laws to be used against like they are right now with the Uhuru movement. And it is our duty to, and that's what this is all about, defend the Constitution against these kind of measures and expect that they will use these measures to suppress us. And if U.S. capitalism were to collapse into full-blown fascism, at that point, the tactical question would be completely different. I mean, at that point, if people did not have the right to peacefully organize, people did not have the right to mobilize and participate in the democratic process, at that point, yeah, if our ability to hold events like this were taken away, and if people's rights to assert themselves politically and democratically were taken away, then obviously the tactics would have to change. But in the context of U.S. society being open at this time, which it is, it should be our duty to try and keep it open and to try and pursue and popularize a peaceful road to socialism. And the question about, is it a tactical question? Yes, it is a tactical question, and it's a matter of emphasis. There are many different things in the Constitution. For example, states' rights. Historically, states' rights has been used for what? Racism, right? So if I'm going around talking about states' rights nowadays, that would, clearly not indicate, good things on my part. However, before the U.S. Civil War, they were talking about states' rights to nullification, states' rights to not cooperate with the fugitive slave law, and that these debates take on a different connotation in different contexts and different times. And that's what's really important about being a Marxist, is we realize that there is no sacred eternality to these questions. We view it from a class perspective, we view it from an anti-imperialist perspective, and it must be decided in the proper context. And that is, increasingly I see a lot of people falling into this ideological trap of just, seeing everything in terms of macro ideology and not understanding the actual context. And so that's how I'd like to frame things. And I guess since this is just closing remarks, I will say this, which is that, the Second International was a huge organization throughout Europe. There were Marxist parties, and Marxist trade unions, and Marxist members of parliament. And Marxism was really, really big and huge all throughout Europe. But then World War I broke out, and all those parties proved they were not revolutionary, and they marched workers off to war. And there was a lot of criticism made of the Second International. And generally, Marxists study Lenin's critique of the Second International, and how Lenin said, look, these parties have abandoned their principles, they represent the temporary privileges of certain stratas of the working class. But in my new book, I talk about George Sorel. And George Sorel is a thinker who was critical of the Second International. He came out of the revisionist wing of Marxism. But he critiqued the Second International not in the way that Lenin critiqued it, but on more of a propaganda and psychological level. And he basically argued that part of the decline of the Second International was that it had lost some degree or other of its spiritual power. By building these huge mass organizations that had many, many thousands of members, by watering down the principles and content to be broad enough to build these huge organizations, when the decisive moment came, these organizations did not have the spiritual power to mobilize forces in the direction. And even in Germany, at the decisive moment, when they were basically handed power at the end of World War I, the German Social Democratic Party had watered down its beliefs, etc. I will say that I've been to Venezuela, and I know why Maduro is still in power, despite everything that's been thrown at them. And that's because when I was in a colectivo in central Caracas, I spoke with a young woman, 19 years old, and she said, I believe God brought me to this earth for one purpose, and that is to die for socialism and to die for Hugo Chavez. And I've been to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I've been to neighborhoods that are strong supporters of Khamenei and strong supporters of the Islamic Republic, and I've heard very similar rhetoric. And that the strength of socialist movements tends to be their ability to tap into a force within human beings, to rise above their material interests, to strive for something higher than themselves, to make great sacrifices for the truth and for the purposes that they believe in. And that is what has made socialist movements around the world successful. And that watering everything down and making it simply a matter of, are you $4 or $5 more an hour or $10 an hour, doesn't particularly do things. And that in the United States, if we are going to build a real serious socialist movement, we are going to have to tap into the things that Americans are willing to die for and are willing to fight for, the sacrifices, the things that Americans hold sacred. And it is inculcated in us from the time that we're children that the right to say what you believe, the right to peacefully assemble, the right to protest, the right to choose your own religion, this is part of what it means to be an American. And right now we see the ruling class of this country, because they need a low-wage police state, because they need World War III to save their system. We see them moving to eradicate those rights and telling us, well, if you think that actually makes you a racist, so we have to get rid of that. Oh, if you think that means you're a right-wing gun nut and that we have to get rid of it. And this is a great moment for those of us who really do believe in building a socialist movement, in empowering average Americans to stand up and be part of the political process, who believe that this war with Russia or China would be a disaster, who reject the low-wage police state and the degrowth policies. This is a moment for us to tap into some of that spiritual power and build a real working-class movement. But doing so means we have to break with the George Soros color revolution apparatus, and it calls itself socialism. So there you go.
So you're in favor of the veil, I guess, right?
What?
You're in favor of the veil, I guess, right?
No.
You're in favor of the Iranian, the Islamic Republic. So therefore, I presume you favor the Islamic Republic's strictures mandating the veil. You apparently are pro-Trump. You are pro-Putin. This is socialism.
Support a sovereign state.
Yes, the Islamic Revolution.
Marxism is about internationalism. It doesn't make a fetish of the sovereign state, of the nation state. It wants to overcome the nation state principle. Just to respond.
Support the Jewish state?
Pardon me?
Support the Jewish state?
Do I, or does Marxism?
No, do you?
Of course not. I don't believe in
What are
any.
you going to do about it?
What am I going to do about it? I believe in the classic call for a socialist federation of the Middle East based on the union of Hebrew, Arab, and over.
You gotta get rid of the Zionist apartheid state first.
How do you get rid of the Zionist apartheid
Because
state first? How do you do that?
They have nuclear.
How do you do that?
Well,
How do you get rid of that state?
First of all, you should go become a citizen of Israel and try to transform that state.
Anyway, I'm not a citizen of Israel. So how do you
easily become one?
I'm a citizen of the United States. I'd rather fight here in the United States. I live here. I'm busy enough here. But the socialistic, the Bolshevik call is for a socialist federation of the Middle East based on the union of all the nationalities, including the Hebrew, the Arab, various Christian groups, other minorities. The Middle East is a prison house of minorities in the same way that the Tsarist Empire was a prison house of minorities. And so we need to fight for minority rights, the national equality, true democracy, and of course that means the complete eradication of any kind of supremacist ideology, Jewish or otherwise. Anyways, just to get back to some of the questions that were asked for you, I even forgot who even asked them. Oh, I see. The 3/5 clause. Yes, the Constitution was racist. I mean, first of all, America was racist. Black people, with very few exceptions, could not vote. I mean, Americans, the franchise is very wide in colonial America, but black people, with insignificant exceptions, had no vote. They did gain votes after the Revolution in the North. Then they were taken away during the Jacksonian period. But it was a racist period in the 3/5, and the Constitution wound up strengthening slavery. It rendered it legally impregnable, which is why we had to have a civil war, to an extra constitutional civil war to do away with slavery. The irony is that the Constitution also strengthened anti-slavery forces. So that's what made it so explosive. That's what preordained the Great Clash of 1861 to 65. But I think it's certainly fair to say the Constitution was riddled with, filled with deep racism. On the question of the Second Amendment, I mean, how is a revolution made? A revolution is not made by us going home and getting our AR-15s, and charging down to the local precinct house and opening fire. That's not how you make a revolution. You make a revolution through mass strikes, a general strike, a situation where workers essentially stop working, seize the means of production, whether it involves the Soviet per se or a movement to a national assembly is really a secondary question. But it's the working class asserting itself through numbers. And yes, when the workers take over the state, they've got to take over the state and use the state to impose a working class dictatorship. And using all the forces of the state to do that, but it doesn't mean that we go there and we just start firing away. I mean, if you want to mount a picket line, the best way to destroy a picket line is to have one of the strikers come with an AR-15, because everyone else will scatter in terror, because they know this crazy guy will take a shot at the police will come with arms, and a picket line will be destroyed. And so if you want to strike, you want to get masses, all the workers in a factory or store or business, whatever it is, massed together in front of that store. Through sheer numbers, and enforcing their will. And if the police break that down, you then push for a general strike, in which you call on other workers and other factories to join the strike. And you want to create a giant mass movement of workers to transform the state, take over the state. But it's through numbers primarily, not through the direct application of armed force. There does come a time for that, but that is much later. And there's a question of the Constitution is a tactical question. Yes, there are tactical questions, but we have to come to grips with the nature of the American Republic as a totality. We have to develop a theory of the American Republic, and that means developing a theory of the structure of the Constitution of that republic. And that means understanding not only how law works, but what the relationship is between law and society. Is law under society? Is law over society? Is a rule of law and a desirable entity in itself, or is law merely an instrument of the revolutionary dictatorship? So, and what does democracy mean? Does democracy mean the channeling decisions through a House, a Senate, a judiciary, etc., or does democracy mean the more direct application of popular sovereignty through sheer numbers. And that, I believe, is I look forward to the revolutionary democratic socialist dictatorship of the entire globe, where the globe's 8 billion people, will essentially make their numbers felt in that overwhelming manner and will directly, through election of parties, take control over the entire global society and everything in it. Anyway, that's it. But just to briefly sum up, we are in the middle of a capitalist crisis due to a crisis of overproduction, as Caleb says, a crisis of profitability. That crisis is manifesting itself in many forms, among which is legal/constitutional, and the ongoing deepening breakdown of this completely sclerotic 18th century structure is a major part of the story. The American polity is simply falling apart due to its advanced age, yet the more decrepit it becomes, the tighter its control over society. So that is essentially an increasingly explosive situation. And because it's explosive, it's potentially revolutionary.
Popular sovereignty was raised, and I think we need to address it. It is the 9th Amendment to the Constitution, right? Power to the people. What is meant by popular sovereignty? Is it simply the masses of people? And what is the relationship between those people and the state? One way I think of thinking about the difference, and Marx writes about this in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, between 1848 and 1789, is that in 1789, and then later with the ascension of Napoleon, the revolution, or the revolutionary people, right, were being led by first the Democratic Republic and then by Napoleon. Under Louis Bonaparte, the people are no longer revolutionary. And so the demand for democracy, which once seemed to be a tool against the old feudal order, against the ancien regime, becomes an instrument of repression, which is nevertheless demanded democratically. And I think in this conversation, a lot of what has fallen out is the question of society, which is not merely a numbers game. It's not the same as the masses, but is rather the complex interrelation of people in their broader activity, right? Not simply political, but also things that would take place in civil society and be completely protected from, in some cases, politics, right? In ancient civilizations, which I teach in my day job, democracy meant the right to vote about whether or not you're going to stone somebody for cheating on her husband. In modern society, we hope that the state will not determine our social life. And that is the vision of the bourgeois revolutions, as enumerated or understood through, for example, the Constitution, which sought to protect that revolutionary society against an oppressive state, or a state that might otherwise undermine the freedom of that society. In the crisis of society, the demand for democracy is posed. And why is this? Well, if, for example, you were living in like 18th century or early 19th century America, you didn't necessarily have to vote, as in your ability to determine your life was not tied to the state. And in fact, it might be adequate for your boss or someone else to vote, somebody who is involved directly in the question of taxation, and your life might be relatively untouched by anything the state does. And the states were very small. Their operating budgets were tiny. They were supposed to play a small role, if any, in the social life of people. When the interests of society no longer seem to be universal, when the general will seems to be split and riven with antagonism, what is the recourse one has when they feel disempowered socially to determine their life? Well, there's politics, and there's the demand for democracy. Marxism sought to clarify the meaning of that demand. And the Party for Socialism, which took up Marxism, sought to mediate the relationship between the self-organization of people in society, their demands on the state, and the state itself, without being identical to any of it. And in the absence of the party, I think we have a severe confusion about what the relationship between society and the state is, or what society even is. I mean, we're talking about a revolution, but what would it mean to actually organize, for society to organize itself towards something like a socialist revolution? Today, it seems as though the only options are to organize within the existing political status quo of the Democrats and Republicans in the United States. And primarily, that means the Democrats, who control every major city in the United States. And so the horizon of progressive politics, which is about the management of the masses via state policy, is substituted for the questions of socialism, for the question of human freedom. And I think that indicative in this entire discussion was the absence of any reflection on what the Marxist Party for Socialism was. And that seems to me to be very of the present, because we've spent the last 5 years equating socialism with progressive capitalism. I mean, that's really been the trajectory of the last 5 years. And I don't know that the current criticism of that trajectory of people like AOC or even the DSA, by saying that, well, they're insufficiently anti-imperialist, is actually qualitatively transforming that question in any way, right? I think we've left ourselves within the realm of progressive politics to have a discussion about how the progressive state should or shouldn't manage social life under capitalism. And as long as that is kind of the narrow straitjacket in which we kind of conceive of the question of socialist politics, it's going to be very hard to understand what historical Marxism was, or to even ask questions about what revolution might be. So I do think that the Constitution plays a very peculiar role within this, because the question of what the Constitution means historically has been sort of falsified by the progressive turn in politics in America in the 20th century, which said, well, the Constitution is a system by which we determine policy, as opposed to understanding the Constitution in its living relationship to revolutionary society, and the task of completing the revolution of society that was started long ago, and which has come into crisis with the emergence of the proletariat on a world stage. And I think that's why somebody like Robert Frost looked at this whole history and said, maybe we're going to be befuddled by Jefferson for another 1,000 years. Because the bourgeois revolution isn't a system of ideas, it's not a logic of a constitution, it's a historical process. And Marxism sought to relate to that historical process critically. Anyway, I guess I'll end there. But
Yeah, thank you all for coming, and thanks to our panelists.
Tell us about NYU Platypus.
Oh yeah, so I think everyone here, I announced at the beginning, but at NYU we run a reading group on Wednesdays at 6 to 9, and we have a coffee break on Mondays at 6 to 9.
No. If you have not seen the movie, it's a novel. It's a novel. It's a movie directed by Elia Kazan, starring Montgomery Clift and Lee Remick. This movie has your name written all over it. It's one of the best. It's probably the most Marxist American movie ever made. It's from 1962.
Gabrielle, do you know a movie called Wild River?
I brought a bunch of the 153s. I think that's the most recent one we had.